So this session's a very quick overview of the ITIL 4 dimensions and the factors that have an impact on those dimensions. So in summary, this is showing the key ingredients that you need to create high quality and value giving products and services. On first look, you can see the word value right in the middle, and a lot of these dimensions and a lot of the factors, it's all about value. It's all about making sure that you are delivering, you are creating value for your stakeholders. The other thing, and I'll talk through each part of the diagram there, but it's worth being aware. You can see the words around the top: political, economical, social, technical, legal, environmental. Those are typically called PESTLE factors that impact the dimensions, and they all influence each other. But if we read it from the centre, so we have value right at the centre of it all, as it should be, then we're creating those products and those services, and then surrounding the products and services, we have the various 4 dimensions. So the organisation and people, the information and technology, value streams and processes, and partners and suppliers. The next few slides I'll talk through, and they will show we'll go into a bit more detail on each one of those, but in summary, those are the 4 dimensions and the various factors that impact those dimensions. So if we start off first of all by looking at organisation and people. So these are around questions for you to be thinking about and to consider, rather than here are the answers to these the dimensions. So first of all, from an organisation and people perspective, consider organisational structure. Is there an organisational structure in place? What type is it? Is it hierarchical? Is it flat? What kind of teams are in place? What roles? Are the roles and the responsibilities set up in such a fashion that you could quite clearly map them to value-giving products and services? Can they be mapped to specific roles? Culture is really, really important in terms of what is the culture? Is it a collaborative culture? Is it a cooperative culture? 2 very different types of cultures in terms of organisation and people, and I will do a session around some of the important terminology. To be collaborative and work in a collaborative fashion is quite different than working in a cooperative fashion, certainly in terms of visions and goals, and are they really shared, or are they slightly competing against each other? Are the teams focused in delivering value to customers? So again, similar to the organisational structure element, are teams really focused on delivering that value, or are they actually just operating the process? The process says to do this, so we operate in this particular fashion. The technology allows us to complete X, Y, and Z. Is that what it's all about? Or are they really looking at value to customers? It's a big consideration. Capacity. Clearly, there's always the question of, we don't have enough people, but are people really supporting practices and their capabilities? Are there bottlenecks somewhere? Are they slowing down the ultimate delivery of value? The other element to this in terms of capacities, the answer isn't always we need more people. It may be, well, okay, let's look at the people that are in place at the moment and the processes and practices that they're following at the moment? Are there opportunities perhaps for some AI or automation activities? Again, I'll do another session around automation and AI, but again, these are questions really to think about. The answer from a capacity perspective, I've seen too often, the answer is we need more people. That's not always the case. Perhaps a closer look at what are people actually doing, what processes, what practices are they doing, and are they doing it in the most efficient way? Governance and oversight, again, what is the balance there between the flexibility and the risk? Clearly different sectors have different approaches to governance. So a good example might be the finance sector would typically have a very strong governance and oversight environment compared to another sector such as charity, as an example. There'll definitely be two different approaches, two different levels of appetite as to how far do you go with governance and oversight. There may even be regulatory requirements. So I've certainly worked in Sarbanes-Oxley environments where there is a very strict governance and oversight requirement. Competence, it's always a tricky one. Are people trained sufficiently? Do they have the sufficient skills, the sufficient knowledge to manage those services and ultimately deliver value to your stakeholders? Are they doing it in an efficient manner? Training could be a good area to look at in terms of further education, further guidance. It's not always a case of having to go on a training course. That there may be other individuals within the organisation, for example, that have a very high level of knowledge, and perhaps they could mentor or shadow or help somebody else to be able to bring other individuals as part of the team up to a greater level. So it's not always about we need to go on lots of training courses and we need lots of people. There's an element when it comes to organisation and people just really thinking about, are there smarter ways of doing this? Communication, so have a think about communication practices. How are your IT and your data team perhaps working together? Are they separate, or are they both delivering value? Are they working collaboratively, or are they working cooperatively? Have a consider about how does that impact your customers that you're serving and your stakeholders. We all know the impact of not communicating to senior stakeholders and keeping people in the picture. So are those communication practices in place? What are they? What are those practices? And then finally, another item for consideration is around interfaces. So how are you interfacing with the wider business? What do you have face-to-face meetings with them? Are there digital touch points perhaps? How are you interfacing? And an interface is two-way as well, and it's an important feedback mechanism in terms of being able to understand what does the business or the business unit and your stakeholders, what are they looking for? What do they need? Are we doing it? Are we achieving it? So ultimately, are they supporting the flow of the value streams? Are they really supporting those streams? Okay, if we go on to information and technology dimension, so items for consideration: what information do you need to create, to reference or change in order to deliver value? What are the inputs for each of those steps in the value streams? And one of the slides further on we'll come on to value streams. What are those outputs? What are those inputs Do we really know what the customer, what your stakeholder wants? Do we understand what those steps are? Something for consideration. It's much easier said than done, for sure. What technology components make up the service that you're delivering? There's going to be lots of different elements to this. So you have storage, networking infrastructure, digital interfaces, various components, both from a technical perspective, but perhaps from a contractual and third-party perspective as well. You may have other vendors in that mix. Do you really understand? Are you able to list out? Are you able to catalogue what are those various components? Could you draw it out on a piece of paper? The storage element, the networking element, the vendor element, the interface. Do you understand those? And one of the value chain activities further on in some of the other presentations I'll do, we'll talk about that in a bit more detail to scratch the surface and start to get into the weeds of it a bit more. So what information do you need to support service management capabilities? What about volume? What about capacity? What about the infrastructure? Is it able to cope? Perhaps it's too much, perhaps it's too little. What about the operations, customer satisfaction, costs? All of these aspects of service management are needed. Do you have that information to hand? Do you know what the volumes are? Perhaps there's even peak volumes. So dependent on the sector that you're working in, there may be renewals, as an example. Certainly in the insurance industry, there are peaks and troughs in terms of periods of peak activity. Renewal season being a high volume period within the year, and that has greater impact on the infrastructure, the demand for that service. What about technology? What do you need in order to deliver and to support service management in itself? Perhaps you have a CMDB or some kind of automation in place. Perhaps there's knowledge base, catalogues, queue management in terms of work coming in and being distributed. Are there any event monitoring tools that you have, or perhaps you need to get hold of in order to be able to support this particular service? Maybe you have those tools in place and they just need to be expanded. Perhaps you need to go out and buy some of these tools. Maybe you even need to develop some of these tools. Again, lots to think about. Certainly tools such as ServiceNow will be able to help in a number of those areas, and can certainly make things like reporting and workflow and process and queue management, in terms of making sure incidents, for example, are ending up with the right teams. Not forgetting reporting and analytics, of course. So reporting, how I've always said it, how can you support and run an environment if you're not reporting on it, if you don't know what it's doing? Is it doing well? Is it not doing well? Do we need to forecast? Have we got analytical data? So being able to have the right tools and the right technology to provide that service. Then finally, security. Again, this is something that's particularly close to my heart. It's really important to make sure that service comes in at the design stage of your service, not halfway through, not at the end, not at the weekly change advisory board when you're looking for to press the button for this service to go live. The last thing you need is somebody to say, what about security? What security considerations have been put in once you're halfway down the road, or pretty much there? Bake those in right at the beginning. It's easier, it's cheaper, it's less disruptive. There may even be depending on the industry you're working in, some kind of regulatory requirements as to what security needs to be in place. The crux of this really is just make sure that security considerations are considered right at the very beginning, right at the design stage, not as you're trying to release it, not as you're halfway through developing it. And then just a final point there around visual impairment and hearing impairment. Again, consider that. Is that a requirement? Is there a percentage of population within the user base that's important? I don't know the answer, but that's the kind of question that you should be asking. Okay, partners and suppliers. So one of the dimensions here is talking about what arrangements in place do you have with third parties. Perhaps you have an offshore provider in place at the moment. Perhaps it's an onshore or a nearshore provider that you've outsourced some of your IT services to. Perhaps it's completely run in-house and you have internal teams. What capabilities do you want to retain in-house? Are there any capabilities that might be better to be outsourced? Operational risk is a key point here. So just as a very practical example, from an operational risk perspective, if a particular service is outsourced, you could benefit from flexibility of resources. So as peaks and troughs from your business cycles come through, if you need to flex up and there needs to be more capacity, that's less of a concern operationally or business operationally if it's outsourced, because an outsourcer can very easily increase capacity, can increase resources much quicker than perhaps you could internally. It's not always the case, but certainly a consideration. Access to resource pools. Again, if you're outsourcing, are those third-party outsourcers able to provide a more flexible workforce for you? They've got specialist knowledge, they have access to a much wider resource pool. Perhaps that resource pool is offshore and provides some commercial benefits. It's clearly less of a risk if there's a contract in place, if it's a fixed cost. Perhaps there are penalties in there, perhaps there are service credits in there. Again, thinking about this strategy, do you want this service to run in-house, or do you want it to run out of house? Perhaps even it's a combination of the two. But these are points to consider, and each individual organisation, each different sector will have different approaches. Scarcity. So we kind of touched on it a few moments ago. Do you have the right skills? Do you have the right people? Do you have the right external partners to fulfill capabilities? Perhaps there are pockets of areas where you may not have the level of skills that you would require. That perhaps you're struggling to secure SQL people, or people with development experience or security experience. Again, it's a question just for consideration. Do you have the right skills in order to provide the service that you're looking to create? And are external partners the right way to go? Perhaps, and only you will be able to advise on that. Cost is another consideration. What does that look like? What does the cost look like if you were to run that operation or that service, that product in-house with your in-house capabilities? What does that cost really look like? What does the cost look like if you were to outsource that? Again, it's a question for consideration. There's no right or wrong answer to this. It's more along the lines of, from a partner, from a supplier's perspective, what does the cost of outsourcing look like versus running it in-house? relationships with suppliers. Do you have regular monthly service reviews, quarterly service reviews? Is there appropriate governance and oversight in place, or are you making sure that your partners and suppliers are being held accountable for the services that they said they are able to provide? I've put service credits in there as a particularly thorny issue as to if you've outsourced a particular service and a particular operation. Clearly, if there's non-performance in there, are there penalties in there? Are there service credits? Is there a way of making sure that level of service, the service levels, the KPIs, are they there? And how does that work against the relationship? Is it a good relationship? Do they understand what you are actually trying to achieve? Do they share your values? Too often I've worked in organisations where services have been outsourced to third parties, and it's very utility driven. They provide this service, and sometimes there is extra value there in terms of bringing those partners and suppliers along on your journey of what is your organisation actually trying to do? What are the values of the company, for example? What are they trying to achieve? And do those partners, do those suppliers buy into that? Are they part of that? Do they understand that? Do they get the strategy? So that relationship piece is really important in terms of making sure that any agreements you have in place, it's not appropriate just to give that to a third party and say you get on with that and you deal with that. There's an ownership from yourself internally to make sure that your relationship with that partner and supplier is a productive one, is a value enabling relationship. And then finally, an item for consideration around partners and suppliers is the flexibility. So perhaps your organisation is growing, perhaps it's getting smaller. Whichever way it is, are your contracts reflective of the services that you're providing? Is it a case of actually, yes, we can bolt on additional services quite easily, and it's not a huge renegotiation activity? Can they literally be bolted on? Maybe it's as simple as a work order. But again, things for consideration. Can that contract grow? Can it get smaller? What kind of flexibility is in there? Are there exit clauses come the worst case situation where you need to pull out of a partner and supplier relationship? Things change quite often, so it's important to have that consideration at the back of your mind. If we want to add an additional service, if we want to grow into a particular country, for example, or a new sector, or a new product line may come along, requirements will change. So try and look for that flexibility and that opportunity to be able to enhance services easily. Okay, so this is the fourth dimension, talks around value streams and processes. So you can see I've written the word PIDOD down here, and I'll come back to that in a minute, because I use that just as a neat way of kind of remembering this diagram here. So the value streams and processes, that's about defining the activities an organisation undertakes, and also how they are organised. Specifically, are they delivering value? So there's that word again, value, value, value. So the service value chain, think of it as an operating model to map value streams, and I'll certainly be doing another session on value streams, because it's a big area, it's a really important area in terms of trying to make sure, are you delivering value with your offerings? So not for this session, but this just sort of gives a very brief high level overview. So that the way to The way to read this is that from demand and opportunity to value, there are a number of steps and considerations to think about, and the value stream mapping picks on a particular item, let's say a P1 for the sake of argument. How do you fix a P1? What you effectively end up doing is mapping the process through these various stages here in order to deliver that product, to deliver that service, which will effectively release value. So briefly, you read this from this side of the slide over to the other slide, but the process itself as to the various stages you go through can kind of weave around. So the way I kind of remember this, and this is where the PIDOD comes in, you'll notice on the slide there's a few, the beginning letter of a few of these words are embolded. So you need to plan, you need to improve, you need to engage. So PIE. And then there's a design and transition element to this activity. Then you need to obtain and build, perhaps in the case of a service pack, for example, you need to obtain a service pack to fix this particular P1 issue. Then you need to deliver and support that that activity, which ends up as a product or a service, which then ends up being delivering value. So as you go through this activity, what are the questions to ask is, what is the definition of value here? Why are we doing this? What are we doing here? So I've mentioned perhaps fix a P1, perhaps it's creation of a brand new service, perhaps it's the delivery process of an existing service. And not for this session, but for another session, I will go into much more detail around the excuse me, the value chain and how to map those. But fundamentally, what it starts to tease out are questions such as, what are the steps we're actually doing? Which ones are creating value? Which are the steps that perhaps, why are we doing that step? I don't understand why we're doing that step is a good question. It teases out some awkward questions. Are all the steps in a particular process delivering value to your customer? Or are there some steps in that process that can be classed as waste? There's no need to do that. We're just doing that because that's what we've been told to do. Is it delivering value to your customer? And the word waste is a key word to think about there, as to can some of these activities be removed? Again, it teases out the question around automation and optimization. As you follow a P1 incident or a new patch or a new service being delivered, it does start to tease questions out around, well, that's quite work intensive. Is there a better way? Is there a smarter way of doing that? Perhaps automation needs to be considered. Is there a repetitive task that somebody is just doing all of the time because that's what they've been told to do? With a bit of clever thinking, bit of design thinking, there may be a better way of optimizing that. And in some cases, some of those steps, you may ask the question, perhaps a third party, perhaps another organisation could do that step for us. Perhaps it could be outsourced. Or likewise, if it's already outsourced, maybe the reverse of that could be true. Why is it outsourced? Maybe we could do that in-house. So this value chain absolutely starts to tease those business value streams out and the processes, and a good way of kind of remembering that is PIDOD. Finally, the PESTLE factors. So these are fairly widely used as factors that can influence dimensions. So I've highlighted in red the first letter of each word, so political P, economical E, social S, technological T, legal L, environmental E. So spelling out PESTLE is an easy way to remember, but all of these factors impact and can change and are different types of consideration against those dimensions. So political questions to ask yourself: is there any government policy? Is there any political stability? Corruption, tax policies, labour laws, any trade restrictions in terms of that service? The answers may well be no to all of them, but it's a good question to ask, because in some cases you only need somebody to say, yeah, hang on a minute, we need to take this into account, or perhaps there's a tax policy that's not being considered with this. There may be additional regulation. Economical, so consider around growth, exchange rates. So if the service involves multiple currencies, different locations, what about interest rates? What about inflation? These are all elements just to kind of tumble around with, have a think about. Is there something in there that we might need to just think about that could have an impact on a particular service, a particular product? I'll speed through the remaining ones quite quickly, but social factors to consider. What are people's health attitudes? What's the lifestyle? Are there any cultural barriers in there? Technological level of innovation. What about automation, R&D activity? How aware are people of technology? Clearly things like legal, extremely important. What are the employment laws? What about consumer protection laws? What about copyright? What about health and safety? All good questions just to ask, do we need to think about this? And then finally, environmental. What about weather, climate, anything else in there that may well be worth asking the question just for consideration? Is there something in there that may impact some of those dimensions? Okay, I will call that a day. If there's any questions, please feel free to subscribe and get in touch with me.